Chevra, it's an honor and delight to be here with Rabbi Mike Moskowitz, who is the scholar-in-residence for trans and queer Jewish studies at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah in New York City, the world's largest LGBTQ synagogue. He's a deeply traditional and radically progressive advocate for trans rights and a vocal ally for LGBTQ inclusivity. Rabbi Moskowitz received 3 ultra-orthodox ordinations while learning in the Mir in Jerusalem, in the Beit Midrash Gavoa in Lakewood, New Jersey. He is a David Hartman Center Fellow and the author of Textual Activism. Check it out. His work on behalf of trans rights began while he served as the rabbi of the Old Broadway Synagogue in Harlem and the Aish New York rabbi at Columbia University. Thanks for taking time to talk.
Thank you for having me.
So on this topic of toxic masculinity, which we know to be such a problem, and thank God more recently becoming more and more clear, even in the news today. So let me start here. Do you think gender itself is real?
It's a great question. Certainly for the transgender community, it's real. If we take a posture of complete egalitarianism, to the extent that men and women are exactly the same, then there's no space to transition. God has gendered attributes within our tradition. God doesn't have a body. We're creating the image of God, and God doesn't have an image. We have a tradition of gendered-based spiritual practice in that a man's arm and a woman's arm aren't different, that like one should require leather boxes. And so it's really interesting to think about where gender lies, and I think that that's really elusive. I think it's almost easier to name places that are a social construction of gender and systems of gender inequality that need to be dismantled, 70 cents on the dollar, like there's all sorts of things that we can say like, well, that's not real. But I think on some level, perhaps on a soul level, gender is very real. What I think is also interesting to point out is that we have... I think unique blends where it's not just a binary, but there's a growing space of gender nonconforming, genderqueer, gender fluid. And so those aren't the only 2 options of like male and female. So I think things can be gendered in really unique blends.
What's some of the language for the space on the spectrum?
Sure.
We say non-binary and or non-gender conforming, but is there a language to kind of fill that space?
Yeah, and I think that the language itself is fluid right now, right? So an umbrella term is one like queer, which means very broad, means a lot of different things, and now it's almost a verb, the queering of. So genderqueer is, I think, a way of saying there's a deviation from the binary, gender fluid, gender nonconforming, GNC, I think, is the way it's often written, but it's also very personal. For some folks, they are skewed towards being more masculine, more feminine. For some, there's a consistency of feeling and awareness of both, and that's often where you find the plural pronouns of they, them. For some, it really depends on the moment. There are times where a person feels more masculine, more feminine. I was at a conference in Toronto, and I saw there was a person who had a necklace that there were kind of these squares with a hole, and one said he, him, one said she, her, one said they, them, and they would like flip it as they felt. So that's kind of an extreme sensitivity to gender in the moment. And for some, it's just, I don't feel masculine or feminine. And gender identity and sexual orientation are also very different. Who a person wants to sleep with is different than who a person is when they go to sleep. So one's an identity, one is an orientation or an attraction. Someone who's asexual is not free from gender. So they're 2 different lanes, and the Hebrew Bible speaks to 2 different kind of topics of wearing misgendered clothing or being with somebody of the same gender. Which themselves have kind of a different set of commentaries and traditions on how to address them. And so it's a clear recognition that gender identity and sexual orientation are different. And on some level, in some ways, they do affect each other. Feminism, for sure, and different waves of feminism have absolutely impacted the way in which we see gender identity and gender played out in society. And it's multiple causality, right? There's a lot of things that contribute, and it's really hard to ever isolate all of the variables. And we need to have the humility that like we actually have no idea. It's really hard, and especially at the intersection of the trans experience in Jewish thought and Jewish law. Is there a moment along a person's personal transition from potentially a name change, hormones, haircut, wardrobe, maybe even surgery, where we can say like, okay, at this point, Jewish law now validates and affirms the gender identity in the moment? Is it when a person is done transitioning? Is like, and it's not clear that we have access to that information, and there's a real need that's urgent to answer the questions. And so a lot of the work at that intersection is about lowering what's at stake within Jewish law to be supportive and inclusive without having to answer that meta question about where gender lies.
Very interesting. So as you described, and that's how I understand it as well, that gender identity and sexual orientation are different lanes. How phenomenologically do those two actually intersect? And based on how you've counseled and talked to folks.
They almost run independently, right? There are people who, when they transition, are still attracted to the same people because it's completely irrelevant, one to the other. One of the other things that we observe is that, especially with young kids, there's a great acute awareness of gender identity with a complete oblivion of sexual orientation, right? A 5-year-old can say, no, I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. I'm not a boy, I'm a girl. Well, who do you like to play with? Like it's not on the radar in terms of sexual orientation, right? So that's something that I think comes from most people much later, and so it also speaks to right, an awareness of something that's independent of the other. There are other observations we can make that are helpful data points. Kind of the first wave of the modern trans experience was predominantly male to female, almost 3-to-1. We're now seeing the reverse, that it's predominantly female to male, also about 3-to-1. And not just in the binary, the space of gender nonconforming is expanding. And so we can offer suggestions or, throw out ideas of why that, but at the end of the day, the question is better than the answer.
Okay, very interesting. So what is it that we mean by the term masculinity?
It's great, right? So what does it mean to be a man, right? What does it mean to that's too feminine, right? So I see these as attributes that we all have, and sometimes there's a more dominant expression of. It might be easier to use a parallel of the commandments, in that every commandment has something that makes it distinct and unique, but it also is an element in all of the other ones. For example, there's an independent mitzvah to honor the Sabbath, right? But every single mitzvah has an aspect of honor in it. And it's just kind of manifested or highlighted, accentuated, right? The red heifer, right, is emblematic of a chok, something that we can't really understand. But every single commandment has aspects of it that we can't understand. So when we think about masculinity, it's often a specific attribute, right, which is just in this moment being manifested or highlighted. It doesn't mean good or bad, right? In other words, toxic masculinity is when masculinity is, right? So what's been interesting in terms of the work within our tradition is an awareness that sometimes these specific attributes are both seen as being positively harnessed and also misappropriated. So we don't have great language within our English culture, American culture right now for positive masculinity, but within our tradition we do have a great idea of kind of a graceful masculinity, which kind of speaks to the role that a man can have. And again, when we talk about men, it doesn't mean man and its people, but the attribute of masculinity being used and harnessed for something constructive and positive. And it's often used interchangeably in terms of gender. So for example, one of the earliest mystical works, Sefer Yetzirah, says that the letter Taf, which is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, governs over Chen, which is grace. And the commentators point out that when you put that letter in the middle of it, it forms the word Chatan, which is groom, right? Which is kind of this very binary masculine role in relationship to another. And so what does that mean to have that awkwardness of, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm marrying somebody who I'm not good enough for, or I just want to be worthy, or I just want to advance the cause of doing something positive, and also recognizing the role of taking whatever resources we have in the moment and networking them to those who need it the most.
So, I wonder if you see these studies all the time. I don't know if they're actually studies or just articles, these headlines that say, actually straight women really want sort of hyper-masculine straight men.
Right.
And the opposite. Those men also want, women who are stereotypically, feminine in these ways. Are those, okay, let people be with their preferences? Or is that, a problem to continue to harness such stereotypical, gender identities?
I think it is problematic because people should be who they are, right? And love is love, and people are attracted to the things that they're attracted and to people they're attracted. I think it's really easy to hate people and things that you've never met or experienced, and so there's just I think a lot of phobia around things that are perceived as different and you're not accustomed to. Masculinity is wonderful, femininity is wonderful. If it's constructive, then there's no wrong way to do it, right? If it's destructive, if it's hurtful, then all of those ways are wrong. No one person has universal appeal, right? And so there's no one way to be a man. There's no one way to be a woman. There's no one way to be genderqueer. There's no one way to be straight or gay, right? There is, I think, both in the let's say, the yeshiva world, where there are constantly kind of competitions within society to become more strict and more, right, to take on more stringencies. And there's a role of that, but then for people who have kind of just been doing it the way that they've always been doing it, right, they kind of get left behind, and they're not from enough, they're not orthodox enough. And I think you see something very similar in really progressive spaces, like, is it, this purity test of, like, if you can't do it 100%, right? And the reality is that there's a lot of good ways of advancing the cause in the right direction, and people do that at different paces, and some people do that with different concentrations, and one's own masculinity or femininity or lack of awareness of that is also just, it's so person specific. So I think it's better, the question is, I think, like, are there healthy ways of being, right, with one's own body? For most people who are not trans or genderqueer, the lack of awareness of gender identity is what makes it difficult to understand that experience, and what allows them to recognize their own identity as being cisgender. Meaning, for most folks, when we're kids, we're told which bathroom to use, and then, like, we don't think about it again. And so for folks who have an expanded awareness of gender, often there'll be some sort of tension between the way in which they see themselves and the world sees themselves. And so part of that transition is in allowing the world to see them the way in which they do.
So what does toxic masculinity look like? And what can we be doing, especially as white cisgender males, to undermine that?
It's always, I think in these conversations, easier to identify, like, what's wrong than it is how to do this right. So there are people who are, like, let's say, like a mensch, right? A person's, like, doing this well, they're well received. One of the things that's interesting about the language is the word of finding grace, which really shows that it's not about the intentions, about the impact. Like, are people being... So I would say, like, when men take up too much space, not just physically, but in conversations, speaking over, interrupting, others, when there's a kind of almost like a steamrolling of this kind of intensity of putting one's presence in there as a way of intimidating, those are things that are often perceived as toxic. Also, elevating oneself through, the minimizing or marginalizing of others, as opposed to trying to elevate other people and really kind of be in this place of ideas, as opposed to a place of privilege. One of the things that's fascinating to hear from folks who have transitioned female to male is the way in which society now listens to them because they're male presenting, right? And so as two guys, when we talk, people listen, right? If whether they want to be in opposition or not, right? There's a certain respect that's given that, like, we're shocked if somebody's you can't interrupt. You're like, but I think for folks who don't have that kind of that are on the other side of that societal dysfunction, right, it's really not pleasant. So I would say, like, the most important thing to do is to listen, right, to be able to be more sensitive to how are my actions affecting those around me, and other things to do, in terms of panels and never, making sure that we take our privilege, that people want to hear what we have to say, and making sure that first person narrative and voice is amplified and given, more than the space of the people who are occupying it unnecessarily.
Great. So since your project Textual Activism, I know, and you started to mention it, your next project being Graceful Masculinity. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of came upon it in Parshas Noach. So the Hebrew word for grace is chen, and it's interesting that those are the same two letters as Noach, right? Nun and ches, except that it goes in the wrong direction. And there's this really interesting arc, no pun intended, with Noah, that he goes from being a really righteous person in his generation, and then you see through the verses that he had this privilege, entitlement, and platform, and all the things, and he's just selfish with it. He's just... his arc was a failed allyship, right? Because he really just cared about himself and his family, and he let the rest of the world perish. And then when he gets out of the arc, it continues in this kind of self-focused way. And it's also interesting that very first verse in that parsha of Noach has 13 words in it, which the commentators point out speak to the 13 years of a man becoming a man. And this is actually like a model of, this is how it could go, but alternatively, right? And the numerical value of the word Noach is 58, in part because he actually overlaps with Abraham for 58 years, and we don't hear from him. And so we know those two letters in the tradition within Judaism of numerology are 8 and 50, which speak to something a little bit supernatural, right? It's circumcision, it's Hanukkah, it's that miraculous piece. And so too, the 7 times 7 that the Torah was given, that people who aren't willing to kind of invest and go against the nature will invariably continue to debase that human relationship. And so it requires like pause and thoughtfulness, introspection, and then some stretching, because it is awkward, it's hard. The person says like, hey, I see what's happening, like I recognize that the way in which we used to speak about things as children is like no longer appropriate. The world has become more sensitive, like I want to get better at this, but I need some feedback. Yeah. And as you know, like it's always hard to ask those who are like marginalized and oppressed to like dig deeper to help us. But that's really what's necessary. And so I started writing like weekly essays on the Parsha that speak to elements of masculinity within that week's Torah portion, with some discussion questions. Mm-hmm. The idea being that it's rare that guys can have this conversation, in part because of the way in which that's perceived as not being masculine. Mm-hmm. When a guy's like, hey, am I like being sensitive enough? Like that doesn't go with the dominant culture of what it means to be a man, and that's problematic. And so having opportunities, perhaps at a Shabbos table, to say like, this is a really interesting insight that tradition teaches us about the way in which people are interacting in the Parsha, like what does that look like to get that right in our society, in our lives? And I think the more we talk about it, the more we can get awareness, and also the more we can get feedback from people who perhaps can recognize that we're trying really hard, but like we're not seeing it clearly. Mm-hmm.
So I think a last question. What's some Torah that guides you in this work? I mean, it's hard to be frum.
Yeah.
Believe in a Kadosh Baruch Hu's influence and presence, believe in the divinity of Torah, commit to halacha, and do progressive work in the world, in particular on LGBTQ issues, which are viewed as out of bounds. So I wonder, like, what's some Torah that either guides your perseverance or guides just the work you do on kind of like a daily meta level?
Yeah. Baruch Hashem, like it's a big Torah and there's a lot that speaks to me. Yeah. But I think the one that for me resonates on the most constant basis is the famous Gemara. For those doing Daf Yomi, it's not that long ago. It was really on in Brachos, that now that we don't, God doesn't have a house anymore, right? I see the divine revelation as God's coming out speech, and I feel like we've now pushed God back into the closet, and so now God doesn't have an address anymore. Right? God is hidden, and so the Talmud says, well, now that we can't like go visit God at God's house, like where do we find God? And the Talmud answers in the 4 cubits of Jewish law, in the Arba Amas of Halacha. So the simple interpretation is, right, so how do you relate to God? Well, we have a code of Jewish law, like do these things throughout the day, make blessings, all the things, and you'll be able to find God in that ritual space. And that's true. But the word hiluch, halacha, comes from that language of progression, of walking, of going forward. And so as somebody who believes that the Torah was given on Mount Sinai, it's eternal, it's infinite, it's immutable, so it's less about construction and invention, more about uncovering and discovering. So I believe that God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai about trans issues. And so that place of that Arba Amas of Halachas of like, what's next? How do we recognize somebody of trans experience, their conversion into Judaism? Like, what does that look like? If there's a woman of trans experience who didn't have bottom surgery and wasn't circumcised, right? Is that body part specific or is that gender specific, right? So it's in those Arba Amas of Halacha, like these questions that are coming up now, which are new for us, that's where I feel we can like find and meet God. And I think if you can sense that you're walking with God, you're in really good company.
Beautiful. So I wonder, just as a follow-up, what do you do with like the Gemara and like Rebbe Akiva and Moshe Rabbeinu being so nervous?
Yeah.
Like, because Rebbe Akiva knew halacha that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't know.
Yeah.
So how do you understand sort of like, an evolving kind of revelation as compared to kind of like a Sinai, maximalist approach?
Sure. So right, it's a great Gemara in Menachos, and it's I think it's a really deep message. For me, I think the Torah is alive, and it needs to speak in present tense. So the question is less about what was written, but rather if we could ask like Das Torah, like the Torah itself could have a voice right now, what would it say is the will of the divine? And that is going to look different in every generation, right? So the Torah is equally applicable, but the way in which we process, right, we're not meant to answer questions, we're meant to answer people. And the people asking the question today are different, right? When the world was less safe and people were suffering in silence, so the question about LGBT inclusivity within the Orthodox world was a different question because there are different competing interests, right? We don't have ambiguity about a verse on fasting on Yom Kippur, and then it's prohibited until it becomes a mitzvah, right? And so too, even the Mishnah and the Talmud itself, it's predicated on a biblical prohibition, right? The Gemara in Gittin says that the oral law you can't write down, the written you can't say orally. And then Rabbi Yehuda Anasi said, like, well, if we don't write it down, it's going to get lost. We can't be more concerned with wisdom getting lost than being concerned about people getting lost. So it's a new question. We need to have, we need to end the horrific rabbinic malpractice of asking queer folks to marry straight. Like everybody loses. It's not sustainable. And so like that was a different question, right? And so we need to have better answers. And so I think the idea that Rabbi Akiva had a Torah and Moshe Rabbeinu had a Torah, it's the same Torah, but like they're speaking to a different set of people. And so like, there's some space there.
Okay, wishing you lots of continued bracha and aslacha.
Yeah.